Welcome to the deep dive. We sift through the complex reports and documents so you don't have to. Today, we're looking into a really deep crisis in Alabama's prison system, ADOC. It's actually turned into a major federal lawsuit. And here's something that immediately caught my eye. It seems completely counterintuitive. Over the past 10 years, use of force incidents inside Alabama prisons jumped 47%. That number is bad enough on its own right. But it happened while the actual number of people incarcerated went down by about 4,000. So you see more force being used on fewer people. How do the sources explain that? Is it just staffing or is it something deeper, something about the culture maybe?
It really seems to point to a fundamental structural breakdown. And that's pretty much what the Department of Justice concluded. We've been digging through the court documents, specifically the DOJ's second amended complaint, and also looking at investigative reporting from places like EJI, the Alabama Reflector, plus that documentary, The Alabama Solution. Our goal here is to unpack what the DOJ found, the really devastating details that triggered this lawsuit, and then look at the state's response, which involves, over $1 billion and is incredibly controversial.
Okay, so let's start with the legal core of this. The DOJ says Alabama is violating inmates' rights, specifically the 8th and 14th Amendments.
That's right. Cruel and unusual punishment and due process. The DOJ's findings basically lay out systemic failure across the board in the 13 major men's prisons.
And they highlighted 4 key areas. What were those?
Yeah, 4 main points, and they're pretty damning. It shows a real deliberate indifference to basic safety and human rights. First, failing to prevent prisoner-on-prisoner violence, and that includes sexual abuse. Second, excessive force by the guards themselves. And third, just failing to maintain safe, livable physical conditions inside the prisons.
And taken together, that creates, an environment where violence just thrives, doesn't it?
Exactly. A pervasive atmosphere of danger and neglect.
The scale of the violence you mentioned, it's hard to wrap your head around. In 2018, the homicide rate in men's prisons was, 7 times the national average?
More than 7 times, yeah. And if you look system-wide, from fiscal year 2015 to 2020, the number of homicides kept climbing. It peaked at 16 in FY 2020.
16 deaths classified as homicide in 1 year.
Right. And here's where it gets even more concerning. The sources strongly suggest that even those numbers aren't reliable. Well, ADOC's own public reports, they have a track record of, let's say, creatively classifying deaths.
Yeah.
We found examples where someone died from multiple stab wounds, but the official internal record called it natural causes.
You're kidding. A stabbing listed as natural cause.
Yeah. So if you can't even accurately label a homicide, how can you possibly track, let alone address, the violence? It suggests a level of denial, really.
And that failure to track violence, or maybe even acknowledge it, seems connected to the sexual abuse crisis you mentioned, too. The number of reported assaults shot up dramatically between 2015 and 2017.
It did, from around 130 reported incidents to over 370, a huge jump.
What's driving that specific type of violence, according to the sources?
It's often tied directly to that lack of control and supervision we talked about.
Yeah.
It becomes almost transactional. It's fueled by the contraband economy inside. Drugs, debts. The sources give these really disturbing examples. Men raped at knife point over a $250 drug debt.
Just $250.
Or being extorted for sex and money by his cellmate, this kind of thing. It only becomes systemic when the staff have effectively lost control and the internal illicit economy dictates survival.
Okay, so the system clearly isn't protecting people. Let's dig into those root causes. Understaffing and overcrowding. Can you boil down the staffing crisis for us? What's the key takeaway?
I think the starkest figure is probably 50%. A court filing basically confirmed ADOC is running at about half capacity for correctional officers. This is back in early 2021. And some of the most, high security or complex facilities, like Donaldson, Bullock, their vacancy rates were pushing 60%. Or even higher.
60%.
Wow.
And we know that level of understaffing, especially when combined with overcrowding, is a recipe for disaster, right?
Absolutely. It's directly linked, not just to the prisoner violence, but also, crucially, to the excessive force by staff. Well, think about it. Officers are stretched incredibly thin, likely fearful for their own safety in such volatile conditions, and completely overworked. It just fosters an environment where force becomes a default, maybe even retaliatory.
And the overcrowding side of that coin? The numbers are just wild. Design capacity versus actual population.
Yeah, the men's prisons were designed for around, 9,500 people?
Roughly, yeah.
But recent reports had them housing closer to 14,250.
So way over capacity, some running at double, even triple.
Exactly. Places like Staten Correctional Facility were reportedly at 265% capacity, Bibb at 193%, Kilby, 180%, just packed.
And that density must lead to horrific physical conditions. You mentioned officials admitting the infrastructure is crumbling. What did that look like on the ground?
It looked pretty medieval, honestly. Two things really stand out as just basic failures. First,
Yeah.
get this. Not a single one of the 13 major prisons had a fully functional fire alarm system.
None. That's unbelievable.
None. And then you have the everyday stuff. Widespread mold, mildew, electrical wires just exposed, raw sewage backing up into living areas, rats, cockroaches. Prisoners at places like Bullock said they had to constantly shift their beds around just to avoid water literally leaking through the ceiling.
His basic habitability gone.
Completely.
And you mentioned how the physical decay impacts safety during violence. That example from Bibb.
Right. The Bibb example is chilling. You have stabbing victims bleeding out, waiting for medical help. Why? Because staff couldn't find the right key to unlock a simple chain link fence separating parts of the facility.
So a basic emergency response is impossible because of crumbling infrastructure and maybe poor procedures.
It's a total breakdown. It shows a failure of management, of safety protocols, everything. And layering onto all this chaos is the contraband economy. Drugs, cell phones, weapons, they're everywhere. And they fuel the violence, the deaths, the fights, the stabbings, the sexual abuse, even homicides.
But wait, how is all this contraband getting in, especially during, say, COVID lockdowns when visitor access was limited?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the strong implication from the sources is staff involvement. The fact that contraband flows freely, even when outside contact is restricted, points fingers inward. And it's not just implication. 2 officers were actually arrested in late 2021 for contraband crimes.
So the people meant to provide security might actually be part of the problem, enabling the very violence they're supposed to prevent.
It seems that way. It shows how deeply compromised the system is.
So it feels like ADOC lost control internally, but then when staff do exert control, it often involves excessive force. And then there's the issue of accountability, or the lack thereof.
Or the lack thereof, exactly.
Yeah.
Impunity seems almost systemic. The DOJ documents detail patterns of force that's disproportionate. Using force against people who are compliant or already restrained, using it as punishment, retaliation, and then, crucially, falsifying the reports afterwards.
Falsifying reports.
And failing to intervene when other officers are using excessive force. It's a culture issue.
And the state ends up paying for this, right? Through lawsuits.
Massively. Since 2020, ADOC has settled over 90 lawsuits alleging excessive force. That's millions and millions of taxpayer dollars going out in settlements, like $40,000 for one prisoner who had ribs broken, a lung collapsed after a 300-pound officer knelt on him.
90 lawsuits since 2020. And we absolutely have to talk about the Stephen Davis case here. It seems to exemplify this whole problem.
The Davis case is incredibly telling, yes. Stephen Davis was beaten to death by a correctional officer.
It's death.
The state settled the resulting civil lawsuit for $250,000. Importantly, they never admitted any wrongdoing as part of that settlement.
Okay, so they paid but didn't admit fault. What happened to the officers involved?
This is where it really shows the system's priorities. The main officer implicated, Roderick Gadsden. He was actually promoted to lieutenant after Davis died.
Promoted after being involved in an inmate's death.
Promoted. And then his name popped up again in another excessive force settlement later on.
So the system pays out millions to settle claims of abuse, but simultaneously promotes officers accused of fatal abuse.
It sends a pretty clear message about where the accountability lies, or rather where it doesn't.
Which brings us to this really stark contradiction you mentioned earlier, the paradox of labor and parole. It feels like the system is working against itself.
It really does.
Yeah.
On one side, you have this incredibly punitive parole system. The grant rate just collapsed. It was over 50% maybe 5 years ago.
And now?
As of 2023, it was down to just 8%. 8%, which of course makes the overcrowding even worse.
So they're keeping more people locked up for longer.
But at the same time, the prison system relies heavily on the labor of these incarcerated people. We're talking about generating something like $450 million a year in goods and services.
$450 million
What?
through prison labor.
Yeah. Prisoners are regularly sent out to work. For private companies, McDonald's, KFC are mentioned, and also for state facilities, even the governor's mansion.
Wait, so these individuals are deemed too dangerous for parole by the state board, which keeps them locked up in these overcrowded, violent prisons. But they're also deemed reliable enough to be sent out to work every day, often in public-facing jobs, generating huge value for the state and private companies.
That's the fundamental tension, isn't it? It creates a powerful disincentive to actually reduce the prison population through parole. Why let go of a workforce that generates nearly $500 million annually?
It sounds almost like modern slavery, justified by deeming them too dangerous for release.
That's precisely the argument groups like the Free Alabama movement make. Leaders like Robert Earl Council, Kinetic Justice, and Melvin Ray use contraband cell phones.
But the same phones the state can't control.
Exactly. They use them to expose these conditions and organize resistance, like the big statewide work stoppage in 2023. They highlighted that the entire system runs on their coerced labor.
Okay, so the system is deemed unconstitutional, it's violent, overcrowded, relies on questionable labor practices, and the state's response, the so-called Alabama solution.
Well, faced with that federal pressure and the undeniable crisis, the state's big answer wasn't decarceration or systemic reform. It was construction.
Building new prisons.
Building a massive new mega prison complex,
And
specifically in Elmore County.
the cost, I remember reading that it just kept going up.
Oh, it ballooned. The initial estimate was around $623 million.
Which is already a lot.
Already huge. But the current price tag, it's sitting at $1.25 billion. That covers construction, furniture, equipment, everything. It's set to be the most expensive prison ever built in the United States.
$1.25 billion. Where did that money come from?
That's where it gets even more controversial.
Huh.
$400 million was diverted from federal COVID-19 relief funds.
COVID relief money used to build a prison.
Yes. And another $100 million was taken directly from the state's education budget.
Diverting funds from education and pandemic relief for a prison. And then there's the naming of this incredibly expensive facility.
Right. It's going to be named the Governor K. Ivey Correctional Complex.
After the current governor.
Yeah.
And her office's justification.
Her office put out a statement saying, essentially, that no governor has done more to improve the correction system.
Despite the record violence, the deaths, the collapsed parole rate happening under her administration.
Despite all of that, it highlights a real disconnect, doesn't it, between the political narrative and the documented reality inside the prisons.
So what's the critique of this solution? Is a brand new billion-dollar prison actually going to fix the problems?
Well, critics argue it's basically just an incredibly extensive Band-Aid. Or maybe worse, an expensive distraction. It completely sidesteps the core need to reduce the prison population, addressing that low parole rate. It funnels enormous amounts of public money to construction contractors.
And does nothing about the staffing crisis or
Okay,
the
well,
culture of impunity.
Exactly. The fear is that you'll just end up with a brand new, very expensive building facing the exact same problems. Chronic understaffing, eventual overcrowding because the parole system is broken, and the same lack of accountability that led to the constitutional violations in the first place. We've seen this happen before when new prisons open.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. What's the key takeaway for you listening to this? We've seen a system judged unconstitutional by the federal government. A system defined by, frankly, deliberate indifference, record levels of violence, reliance on forced labor. And its response is to spend billions on new buildings and legal settlements while actively promoting staff accused of fatal excessive force.
It's a really stark case study, isn't it? It shows how powerful structural incentive, like profit from labor, the political points scored by being tough on crime, the inertia of bureaucracy can completely override constitutional duties and basic human safety. And while Alabama might be an extreme example documented by the DOJ, the underlying drivers, the secrecy, the lack of real accountability, the punitive mindset over rehabilitation or release, those aren't unique to Alabama at all.
They exist elsewhere.
They're features, unfortunately, you can find in many prison systems across the U.S. Alabama just provided a very clear, very well-documented case of just how bad it can get when those factors converge with deliberate indifference.
So, let's leave you with a final thought to consider. The state of Alabama is spending millions defending officers in excessive force lawsuits. It's spending over $1 billion building the most expensive prison in American history. Yet ADOC's own spokesperson admitted to reporters that the department does not systematically track how many cases of excessive force by its own staff are actually referred to local district attorneys for potential criminal prosecution.
They don't track it.
They don't track potential criminal conduct by their own employees. So what does that failure, that deliberate choice not to track, tell us about the real unspoken priorities of this system?